Okay, let's get started. My name is በዕውቀቱ ስዩም. I'm a writer, a poet, and an essayist. I'm now a research scholar in Chatham University, and I'm also a writer in residence in City of Assylum, Pittsburgh. So I'm going to read you a short note about myself, about my writing and my vision. So the title is The Dog That Dared to Enter a Temple. When I come from, there is a common expression describing someone physically beat up as being stoned like a dog who dared to enter a temple. For a society that considered dogs impure to be admitted in the holy places, all actions become justified the moment the dog tries to cross from what is carnal into what is reserved for the divine. This sentiment of chasing dog is not limited to the dogs only, but into our everyday lives. Though in another name, we live the creed through visible or invisible manifestations. I was born and raised in a small town called Mangusa in Gojam, Western Ethiopia. The town had no dedicated space or park for children to play. Television had not been introduced to the town, and only a few people could afford tape recorders. The only pleasurable escapade for children was the stories our elders told, which from time to time we retold to each other. When it was my turn to tell stories, the ones I heard from family were not numerous enough to fill all the time I have. To satisfy the demand of my listeners, I have to invent new ones and on another occasions to retell stories I heard from my family by reshaping and expanding them with more details. From those early moments of storytelling, the effects I started to witness on the face of my listeners were not only encouraging, but a confirmation that perhaps I was good at creating stuff and entertaining people. However, more than just the pleasures I derived out of relating stories to my friends, it was the transcendence effect that act of storytelling had created in me that I remember the most. The stories provided not only a fascinating escape, but also accidental discovery and expansion of a new world. In this new world, I was not only without any vision, but was with new companies who inhabit the geography of the new world in the form of monsters, magicians, princes, heroes, kings, magical rings, and flying chariots. The more I told stories, the new world grew more interesting, almost like a substitution for the real one, where almost nothing fascinating happened. Telling stories was my way of breaking an escape through the dreary wall of silence and deprived fun into a world where I almost skipped my entire childhood. When I was growing up, children's literature was non-existent and nursery rhyme was not the norm. There were some traditional songs for children which contained mostly adult themes. The distinction between adults and children was almost invisible. Children worked like adults and talked like them. Grown-ups created the world in their image, and the children had to adapt to it. My first attempt at rhyming began by trying a form of the dual poetry game known as Nkasalamtiya, which in Amharic means, behold my greetings. The literal meaning of the word does little justice to the nature of the dual poem because it has nothing to do with greetings. Nkasalamtiya is approximately close to Yo Mama jokes or slightly vulgar rendition of knock-knock jokes. To engage in Nkasalamtiya, children from two combating groups. To engage in Nkasalamtiya, children form two combating groups. Each group would then select a sharp-tongued representative. The verbal duel commences when the first child opens the game by hurling the nastiest insult against the other group's representative, formulated in two-liners. The verse should contain obscene words coined to trash the mother of the rival boy. Then the match would improvise a response. This would back and forth continues amid laughter and applaud by listeners until one of the fighters ran out of words. It was this way, through a dual two-liners and vulgar jokes, that I was introduced to rhyming. In my adolescence, books were not easy to access in town. Although my father was a teacher, he was not interested in literary works and creative writing. His shelf consisted of volumes of books related to... In my adolescence, books were not easy to access in town. Although my father was a teacher, he was not interested in literary works and creative writing. His shelf consisted of volumes of books related to the subject matter he was teaching. Fortunately, there was a man in our neighborhood who loved to collect novels and stories and encouraged young people to read. He was happy to lend me some books. The time being the advent of socialism in Ethiopian political scene, most of the popular books available were by Russian authors. Because of the regime affiliation to Russia, a lot of Russian literature was translated into Amharic and published by state-owned publishers. Gorky was a much preferred choice than Hemingway. It did not take me long to notice that most of the Russian life and culture described in these novels and stories I read in Russian literary giants' works were remarkably similar to ours. In those books, I not only found people who go hungry to bed like I used to, but also people who struggle with the nature of oppressors as means in my country used to. So, in the mind of my youth, Russia was not a foreign country, but rather like a distant extension of Ethiopia. It was Russian novels that made me realize that suffering is the language of the world. Since then, books have made it possible for me to travel and embrace those that were away as real and present as if in the act of reading Walls Fall. A few years ago, I was in China and had the opportunity to walk on the steps of famous Chinese wall. However, while walking and admiring the great edifice, the experience had brought to mind how the idea of walls are one commonly human share. Two other walls from Ethiopia were in my mind, Jagol and the ruins of Addis Ababa. As the Great Wall was erected as a defense from warring tribes at the time considered by the Chinese as barbarians, Jagol wall surrounded the city of Harar in East Ethiopia was built for the same purpose. The Chinese wall was erected by the emperors of the time. So was Harar's Jagol, commissioned by the emirs to protect the city from the raid of pastoralist tribes around them. The other wall I was reminded of is no more standing. Only the ruins of it now remain in northern Addis Ababa. The leftover of all these walls reveal the profound architectural achievements of people in the past. They also betray the fact that all walls are not invisible. They could be breached by the very people the builders intended to stop as others. In every historical epoch, people in power have divided members of a given society into competing classes: lords versus subjects, civilized versus barbarians, pure versus mixed, blacks versus whites. They have made sure that these boundaries are left intact. As an old Ethiopian saying from the time of the nobility puts it, the children of the nobility to the city, children of the poor to the gutter. A few years ago, some officials of Addis Ababa municipality administration summoned peasants who migrated to the capital and by roaming around the capital city begged for alms. The influence of farmers was triggered by, among others, lost crops, drought, and other frustration by failing yield. However, the presence of a large number of these farmers in the capital meant embarrassment for the city administration and the federal leaders as it threatened to expose the cracks in the agricultural economy they were praising. So people in power decided to solve the problem by sending all the farmers back to where they came from, by force. During a televised gathering, one of the old beggar farmers said, "We know you are throwing us out of the city, but mark my word, we will come again." One of the lessons of history is that when one builds a wall, one also creates the temptation to breach it. This is especially true for riders of any age in most societies. History is full of examples where society and the power that often conspire to set a boundary on riders. History is full of examples where society and the power that often conspire to set a boundary on riders, always insisting on dictating how the rider should not tread beyond the line or wall, visible and invisible, set between him and the forbidden tree of societies, is a common catalogue in the annals of nations. What is regarded as an acceptable idea, symbol, and language often manufactured by power and special interest and promoted by official media is the age-old instance to keep the uncompromising soul of the rider at bay. Threats of destitution, persecution, exile, imprisonment, torture, and even death are still the prices paid for trying to pass the walls like a dog is from temples. Building walls and boundaries by society, coupled with the dare by riders to chip away the wall, one word at a time, has been defining the space my career has occupied. Defining the space of my career has occupied. And when I think of my journey as a writer, the default position I occupied has always been that of negotiation with walls and boundaries. That's why I see myself like the barbarian who refused to stay outside the great walls, the beggar who is unwilling to be thrown out of the capital, the proverbial dog that will not resist the temptation of entering the temple. Thank you very much.